Section 38 of Jean-Christophe in Paris. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Jean-Christophe in Paris by Romain Rolland, translated by Gilbert Canon. The House. Chapter 2, Part 5. At the same time as he realized the absurdity of moral frontiers between the honest men of different nationalities, Christophe began to see the absurdity of the frontiers that lay between the different ideas of honest men of the same nationality. Thanks to him, though without any deliberate effort on his part, the Abbé Corneille and Monsieur Watelet, two men who seemed very far indeed from understanding each other, made friends. Christophe used to borrow books from both of them, and with a want of ceremony which shocked Olivier, he used to lend their books in turn to the other. The Abbé Corneille was not at all scandalized. He had an intuitive perception of the quality of a man, and without seeming to do so, he had marked the generous and even unconsciously religious nature of his young neighbor. A book by Kropotkin, which had been borrowed from Monsieur Watelet, and for different reasons had given great pleasure to all three of them, began the process of bringing them together. It chanced one evening that they met in Christophe's room. At first Christophe was afraid that they might be rude to each other, but on the contrary they were perfectly polite. They discussed various sage subjects, their travels and their experience of men, and they discovered in each other a fund of gentleness and the spirit of the Gospels, and chimerical hopes, in spite of the many reasons that each had for despair. They discovered a mutual sympathy, mingled with a little irony. Their sympathy was of a very discreet nature. They never revealed their fundamental beliefs. They rarely met and did not try to meet, but when they did so they were glad to see each other. Of the two men, the Abbé Corneille was not the least independent of mind, though Christophe would never have thought it. He gradually came to perceive the greatness of the religious and yet free ideas, the immense, serene, and unfevered mysticism which permeated the priest's whole mind, the every action of his daily life, and his whole outlook on the world, leading him to live in Christ as he believed that Christ had lived in God. He denied nothing, no single element of life. To him the whole of Scripture, ancient and modern, lay and religious, from Moses to Berthelot, was certain, divine, the very expression of God. Holy Writ was to him only its richest example, just as the Church was the highest company of men united in the brotherhood of God. But in neither of them was the spirit confined in any fixed, unchanging truth. Christianity was the living Christ. The history of the world was only the history of the perpetual advance of the idea of God. The fall of the Jewish temple, the ruin of the pagan world, the repulse of the Crusades, the humiliation of Boniface VIII, Galileo flinging the world back into giddy space, the infinitely little becoming more mighty than the great, the downfall of kingdoms and the end of the concordats. All these, for a time, threw the minds of men out of their reckoning. Some clung desperately to the passing order, some caught at a plank and drifted. The Abbé Corneille only asked, "Where do we stand as men? Where is that which makes us live?" For he believed, where life is, there is God, and that was why he was in sympathy with Christophe. For his part, Christophe was glad once more to hear the splendid music of a great religious soul. It woke in him echoes distant and profound. Through the feeling of perpetual reaction which is in vigorous natures a vital instinct, the instinct of self-preservation, the stroke which preserves the quivering balance of the boat and gives it a new drive onward, his surfeit of doubts and his disgust with Parisian sensuality had for the last 2 years been slowly restoring God to his place in Christophe's heart. Not that he believed in God, he denied God, but he was filled with the Spirit of God. The Abbé Corneille used to tell him with a smile that, like his namesake, the sainted giant, he bore God on his shoulders without knowing it. "How is it that I don't see it, then?" Christophe would ask. "You are like thousands of others. You see God every day and never know that it is He. God reveals himself to all in every shape. To some he appears in their daily life, as he did to St. Peter in Galilee. To others, like your friend Monsieur Watelet, as he did to St. Thomas, in wounds and suffering that call for healing. To you in the dignity of your ideal, noli me tangere. Some day you will know it." "I will never surrender," said Christophe. "I'm free, free I shall remain." "Only the more will you live in God," replied the priest calmly. But Christophe would not admit to being made out a Christian against his will. He defended himself ardently and simply, as though it mattered in the least whether one label more than another was plastered on to his ideas. The Abbé Corneille would listen with a faint ecclesiastical irony that was hardly perceptible, while it was altogether kindly. He had an inexhaustible fund of patience based on his habit of faith. It had been tempered by the trials to which the existing church had exposed him, while it had made him profoundly melancholy and had even dragged him through terrible moral crises. He had not really been touched by it all. It was cruel to suffer the oppression of his superiors, to have his every action spied upon by the bishops and watched by the free thinkers, who were endeavouring to exploit his ideas, to use him as a weapon against his own faith, and to be misunderstood and attacked both by his co-religionists and the enemies of his religion. It was impossible for him to offer any resistance, for submission was enforced upon him. It was impossible for him to submit in his heart, for he knew that the authorities were wrong. It was agony for him to hold his peace. It was agony for him to speak and to be wrongly interpreted. Not to mention the soul for which he was responsible, he had to think of those who looked to him for counsel and help, while he had to stand by and see them suffer. The Abbé Corneille suffered, both for them and for himself, but he was resigned. He knew how small a thing were the days of trial in the long history of the Church. Only by dint of being turned in upon himself in his silent resignation, slowly he lost heart and became timid and afraid to speak, so that it became more and more difficult for him to do anything, and little by little the torpor of silence crept over him. Meeting Christophe had given him new courage. His neighbour's youthful ardour and the affectionate and simple interest which he took in his doings, his sometimes indiscreet questions, did him a great deal of good. Christophe forced him to mix once more with living men and women. Aubert, the journeyman electrician, once met him in Christophe's room. He started back when he saw the priest and found it hard to conceal his feeling of dislike. Even when he had overcome his first inclination, he was uncomfortable and oddly embarrassed at finding himself in the company of a man in a cassock, a creature to whom he could attach no exact definition. However, his sociable instincts and the pleasure he always found in talking to educated men were stronger than his anti-clericalism. He was surprised by the pleasant relations existing between M. Vautelet and the Abbé Corneille. He was no less surprised to find a priest who was a democrat and a revolutionary who was an aristocrat. It upset all his preconceived ideas. He tried vainly to classify them in any social category, for he always had to classify people before he could begin to understand them. It was not easy to find a pigeonhole for the peaceful freedom of mind of a priest who had read Anatole France and Renan, and was prepared to discuss them calmly, justly, and with some knowledge. In matters of science, the Abbé Corneille's way was to accept the guidance of those who knew, rather than of those who laid down the law. He respected authority, but in his eyes it stood lower than knowledge. The flesh, the spirit, and charity, the three orders, the three rungs of the divine ladder, the ladder of Jacob. Of course, honest Aubert was far indeed from understanding or even from dreaming of the possibility of such a state of mind. The Abbé Corneille used to tell Christophe that Aubert reminded him of certain French peasants whom he had seen one day. A young Englishwoman had asked them the way in English. They listened solemnly, but did not understand. Then they spoke in French. She did not understand. Then they looked at each other pityingly and wagged their heads and went on with their work and said, "What a pity, what a pity! Such a pretty girl, too," as though they had thought her deaf or dumb or soft in the head. At first Aubert was abashed by the knowledge and distinguished manners of the priest and M. Vautelet, and sat mum, listening intently to what they said. Then little by little he joined in the conversation, giving way to the naive pleasure that he found in hearing himself speak. He paraded his generous store of rather vague ideas. The other two would listen politely and smile inwardly. Aubert was delighted. He could not hold himself in. He took advantage of, and presently abused, the inexhaustible patience of the Abbé Corneille. He read his literary productions to him. The priest listened resignedly, and it did not bore him overmuch, for he listened not so much to the words as to the man, and then he would reply to Christophe's commiseration, "Bah! I hear so many of them." Aubert was grateful to Monsieur Watelet and the Abbé Cornet, and without taking much trouble to understand each other's ideas or even to find out what they were, the three of them became very good friends without exactly knowing why. They were very surprised to find themselves so intimate. They would never have thought it. Christophe was the bond between them. He had other innocent allies in the three children, the two little Elsbergers and Monsieur Watelet's adopted daughter. He was great friends with them. They adored him. He told each of them about the other and gave them an irresistible longing to know each other. They used to make signs to each other from the windows and spoke to each other furtively on the stairs. Aided and abetted by Christophe, they even managed to get permission sometimes to meet in the Luxembourg Gardens. Christophe was delighted with the success of his guile, and went to see them there the first time they were together. They were shy and embarrassed, and hardly knew what to make of their new happiness. He broke down their reserve in a moment, and invented games for them and races, and played hide-and-seek. He joined in as keenly as though he were a child of 10. The passers-by cast amused and quizzical glances at the great big fellow running and shouting and dodging round trees with 3 little girls after him. And as their parents were still suspicious of each other and showed no great readiness to let these excursions to the Luxembourg Gardens occur very often, because it kept them too far out of sight, Christophe managed to get Commandant Chabrin, who lived on the ground floor, to invite the children to play in the garden belonging to the house. Chance had thrown Christophe and the old soldier together. Chance always singles out those who can turn it to account. Christophe's writing table was near his window. One day the wind blew a few sheets of music down into the garden. Christophe rushed down, bareheaded and dishevelled just as he was, without even taking the trouble to brush his hair. He thought he would only have to see a servant. However, the daughter opened the door to him. He was rather taken aback, but told her what he'd come for. She smiled and let him in. They went into the garden. When he had picked up his papers, he was for hurrying away, and she was taking him to the door when they met the old soldier. The commandant gazed at his odd visitor in some surprise. His daughter laughed and introduced him. "Ah, so you are the musician," said the old soldier. "We are comrades." They shook hands. They talked in a friendly, bantering tone of the concerts they gave together, Christophe with his piano, the commandant with his flute. Christophe tried to go, but the old man would not let him, and he plunged blindly into a disquisition on music. Suddenly he stopped short and said, "Come and see my cannons." Christophe followed him, wondering how anybody could be interested in anything he might think about French artillery. The old man showed him in triumph a number of musical cannons, amazing productions, compositions that might just as well be read upside down or played as duets, one person playing the right-hand page and the other the left. The commandant was an old pupil of the Polytechnic and had always had a taste for music, but what he loved most of all in it was the mathematical problem. It seemed to him, as up to a point it is, a magnificent mental gymnastic, and he racked his brains in the invention and solution of puzzles in the construction of music, each more useless and extravagant than the last. Of course, his military career had not left him much time for the development of his mania, but since his retirement he had thrown himself into it with enthusiasm. He expended on it all the energy and ingenuity which he had previously employed in pursuing the hordes of Negro kings through the deserts of Africa, or avoiding their traps. Christophe found his puzzles quite amusing, and set him a more complicated one to solve. The old soldier was delighted. They vied with one another. They produced a perfect shower of musical riddles. After they'd been playing the game for some time, Christophe went upstairs to his own room. But the very next morning his neighbour sent him a new problem, a regular teaser, at which the commandant had been working half the night. He replied with another, and the duel went on until Christophe, who was getting tired of it, declared himself beaten, at which the old soldier was perfectly delighted. He regarded his success as a retaliation on Germany. He invited Christophe to lunch. Christophe's frankness in telling the old soldier that he detested his musical compositions, and shouting in protest when Chabrin began to murder an Andante of Haydn on his harmonium, completed the conquest. From that time on, they often met to talk, but not about music. Christophe could not summon up any great interest in his neighbour's crotchety notions about it, and much preferred getting him to talk about military subjects. The commandant asked nothing better. Music was only a forced amusement for the unhappy man. In reality, he was fretting his life out. He was easily led on to yarn about his African campaigns, gigantic adventures worthy of the tales of a Pizarro and a Cortez. Christophe was delighted with the vivid narrative of that marvellous and barbaric epic, of which he knew nothing, and almost every Frenchman is ignorant, the tale of the 20 years during which the heroism and courage and inventiveness and superhuman energy of a conquering handful of Frenchmen were spent far away in the depths of the Black Continent, where they were surrounded by armies of Negroes, where they were deprived of the most rudimentary arms of war, and yet, in the face of public opinion and a panic-stricken government, in spite of France, conquered for France an empire greater than France itself. There was the flavour of a mighty joy, a flavour of blood in the tale, from which, in Christophe's mind's eye, there sprang the figures of modern condottieri, heroic adventurers unlooked for in the France of today, whom the France of today is ashamed to own, so that she modestly draws a veil over them. The commandant's voice would ring out bravely as he recalled it all, and he would jovially recount with learned descriptions, oddly interpolated in his epic narrative, of the geological structure of the country, in cold, precise terms, the story of the tremendous marches and the charges at full gallop, and the man-hunts in which he had been hunter and quarry, turn and turn about in a struggle to the death. Christophe would listen and watch his face and feel a great pity for such a splendid human animal, condemned to inaction and forced to spend his time in playing ridiculous games. He wondered how he could ever have become resigned to such a lot. He asked the old man how he had done it. The commandant was at first not at all inclined to let a stranger into his confidence as to his grievances, but the French are naturally loquacious, especially when they have a chance of pitching into each other. "What on earth should I do," he said, "in the army as it is today? The Marines write books. The infantry study sociology. They do everything but make war. They don't even prepare for it. They prepare never to go to war again. They study the philosophy of war." The philosophy of war! That's a game for beasts of burden, wondering how much thrashing they're going to get. Discussing, philosophizing. No, that's not my work. Much better stay at home and go on with my cannons. He was too much ashamed to air the most serious of his grievances, the suspicion created among the officers by the appeal to informers, the humiliation of having to submit to the insolent orders of certain crass and mischievous politicians, the army's disgust at being put to base police duty, taking inventories of the churches, putting down industrial strikes at the bidding of capital and the spite of the party in power, the petty burgess, radicals and anti-clericals against the rest of the country. Not to speak of the old African's disgust with the new colonial army, which was for the most part recruited from the lowest elements of the nation by way of pandering to the egoism and cowardice of the rest, who refused to share in the honour and the risks of securing the defence of Greater France, France beyond the seas. Christophe was not concerned with these French quarrels. They were no affair of his, but he sympathized with the old soldier. Whatever he might think of war, it seemed to him that an army was meant to produce soldiers as an apple tree to produce apples, and that it was a strange perversion to graft it on to politicians, aesthetes, and sociologists, and yet he could not understand how a man of such vigour could give way to his adversaries. It is to be his own worst enemy for a man not to fight his enemies. In all French people of any worth at all, there was a spirit of surrender, a strange temper of renunciation. To Christophe it was even more profound and even more touching as it existed in the old soldier's daughter. Her name was Céline. She had beautiful hair, plaited and braided so as to set off her high, round forehead, and her rather pointed ears, her thin cheeks and her pretty chin. She was like a country girl with fine, intelligent dark eyes, very trustful, very soft, rather short-sighted. Her nose was a little too large, and she had a tiny mole on her upper lip by the corner of her mouth, and she had a quiet smile, which made her pout prettily and thrust out her lower lip, which was a little protruding. She was kind, active, clever, but she had no curiosity of mind. She read very little and never any of the newest books, never went to the theatre, never travelled, for travelling bored her father, who had had too much of it in the old days, never had anything to do with any polite charitable work. Her father used to condemn all such things, made no attempt to study. He used to make fun of blue stockings. hardly ever left her little patch of garden enclosed by its 4 high walls, so that it was like being at the bottom of a deep well. And yet she was not really bored. She occupied her time as best she could, and was good-tempered and resigned. About her and about the setting which every woman unconsciously creates for herself wherever she may be, there was a Chaudinesque atmosphere, the same soft silence, the same tranquil expression, the same attitude of absorption, a little drowsy and languid. In the common task, the poetry of the daily round, of the accustomed way of life with its fixed thoughts and actions, falling into exactly the same place at exactly the same time, thoughts and actions which are cherished none the less with an all-pervading tranquil gentleness, the serene mediocrity of the fine-souled women of the middle class, honest, conscientious, truthful, calm in their pleasures, unruffled in their labours, and yet poetic in all their qualities. They are healthy and neat and tidy, clean in body and mind. All their lives are sweetened with the scent of good bread and lavender and integrity and kindness. There is a peace in all that they are and do, the peace of old houses and smiling souls. Christophe, whose affectionate trustfulness invited trust, had become very friendly with her. They used to talk quite frankly, and he even went so far as to ask her certain questions which she was surprised to find herself answering. She would tell him things which she had not told anybody, even her most intimate friends. "You see," Christophe would say, "you're not afraid of me. There's no danger of our falling in love with each other. We're too good friends for that." "You're very polite," she would answer with a laugh. Her healthy nature recoiled as much as Christophe's from philandering friendship, that form of sentimentality dear to equivocal men and women who are always juggling with their emotions. They were just comrades, one to another. He asked her one day what she was doing in the afternoons when he saw her sitting in the garden with her work on her knees, never touching it, and not stirring for hours together. She blushed and protested that it was not a matter of hours, but only a matter of a few minutes, perhaps a quarter of an hour, during which she went on with her story. "What story?" "The story I'm always telling myself." "You tell yourself stories?" "Oh, tell them to me." She told him that he was too curious. She would only go so far as to intimate that they were stories of which she was not the heroine. He was surprised at that. "If you're going to tell yourself stories, it seems to me it would be more natural if you told your own story with embellishments and lived in a happier dream life." "I couldn't," she said. "If I did that, I should become desperate." She blushed again at having revealed even so much of her inmost thoughts, and she went on. "Besides, when I'm in the garden and a gust of wind reaches me, I'm happy. Then the garden comes alive for me, and when the wind blusters and comes from a great distance, he tells me so many things." In spite of her reserve, Christophe could see the hidden depths of melancholy that lay behind her good humour, and the restless activity which, as she knew perfectly well, led nowhere. Why did she not try to break away from her condition and emancipate herself? She would have been so well fitted for a useful and active life. But she alleged her affection for her father, who would not hear of her leaving him. In vain did Christophe tell her that the old soldier was perfectly vigorous and energetic, and had no need of her, and that a man of his stamp could quite well be left alone, and had no right to make a sacrifice of her. She would begin to defend her father by a pious fiction. She would pretend that it was not her father who was forcing her to stay, but she herself who could not bear to leave him. And up to a point what she said was true. It seemed to have been accepted from time immemorial by herself and her father and all their friends, that their life had to be thus, and not otherwise. She had a married brother who thought it quite natural that she should devote her life to their father in his stead. He was entirely wrapped up in his children. He loved them jealously and left them no will of their own. His love for his children was to him, and especially to his wife, a voluntary bondage, which weighed heavily on their life and cramped all their movements. His idea seemed to be that as soon as a man has children, his own life comes to an end, and he has to stop short in his own development. He was still young, active, and intelligent, and there he was reckoning up the years he would have still to work before he could retire. Christophe saw how these good people were weighed down by the atmosphere of family affection, which is so deep-rooted in France, deep-rooted but stifling and destructive of vitality. And it has become all the more oppressive since families in France have been reduced to the minimum. father, mother, one or two children, and here and there perhaps an uncle or an aunt. It is a cowardly, fearful love turned in upon itself like a miser clinging tightly to his hoard of gold. A fortuitous circumstance gave Christophe a yet greater interest in the girl, and showed him the full extent of the suppression of the emotions of the French, their fear of life, of letting themselves go and claiming their birthright. Elsberger, the engineer, had a brother 10 years younger than himself, likewise an engineer. He was a very good fellow, like thousands of others of the middle class, and he had artistic aspirations. He was one of those people who would like to practice an art, but are afraid of compromising their reputation and position. As a matter of fact, it's not a very difficult problem, and most of the artists of today have solved it without any great danger to themselves. But it needs a certain amount of willpower, and not everybody is capable of even that much expenditure of energy. Such people are not sure enough of wanting what they really want, and as their position in life grows more assured, they submit and drift along without any show of revolt or protest. They cannot be blamed if they become good citizens instead of bad artists, but their disappointment too often leaves behind it a secret discontent, a qualis artifex pereo, which, as best it can, assumes a crust of what is usually called philosophy, and spoils their lives until the wear and tear of daily life and new anxieties have erased all trace of the old bitterness. Such was the case of André Elsberger. He would have liked to be a writer, but his brother, who was very self-willed, had made him follow in his footsteps and enter upon a scientific career. André was clever and quite well equipped for scientific work, or for literature for that matter. He was not sure enough of being an artist, and he was too sure that he was middle class, and so, provisionally at first, one knows what that means, he had bowed to his brother's wishes. He entered the Centrale, high up in the list, and passed out equally high, and since then he had practiced his profession as an engineer conscientiously, but without being interested in it. Of course he had lost the little artistic quality that he possessed, and he never spoke of it except ironically. And then, he used to say, Christophe recognized Olivier's pessimistic tendency in his arguments, life is not good enough to make one worry about a spoiled career. What does a bad poet, more or less, matter? The brothers were fond of one another. They were of the same stamp morally, but they did not get on well together. They had both been Dreyfus mad. But André was attracted by syndicalism and was an anti-militarist, and Élie was a patriot. From time to time, André would visit Christophe without going to see his brother, and that astonished Christophe, for there was no great sympathy between himself and André, who used hardly ever to open his mouth except to gird at something or somebody, which was very tiresome, and when Christophe said anything, André would not listen. Christophe made no effort to conceal the fact that he found his visits a nuisance, but André did not mind and seemed not to notice it. At last Christophe found the key to the riddle one day when he found his visitor leaning out of the window and paying much more attention to what was happening in the garden below than to what he was saying. He remarked upon it, and André was not reluctant to admit that he knew Mademoiselle Chabrin, and that she had something to do with his visits to Christophe. And his tongue being loosed, he confessed that he had long been attached to the girl, and perhaps something more than that. The Elsbergers had long ago been in close touch with the Chabrins, but though they had been very intimate, politics and recent events had separated them, and thereafter they saw very little of each other. Christophe did not disguise his opinion that it was an idiotic state of things. Was it impossible for people to think differently, and yet to retain their mutual esteem? André said he thought it was, and protested that he was very broad-minded, but he would not admit the possibility of tolerance in certain questions, concerning which he said he could not admit any opinion different from his own, and he instanced the famous affair. On that, as usual, he became wild. Christophe knew the sort of thing that happened in that connection, and made no attempt to argue, but he asked whether the affair was ever going to come to an end, or whether its curse was to go on and on to the end of time, descending even unto the third and fourth generation. André began to laugh, and without answering Christophe, he felt a tender praise of Céline Chabrin, and protested against her father's selfishness, who thought it quite natural that she should be sacrificed to him. "Why don't you marry her?" asked Christophe, "if you love her and she loves you?" André said mournfully that Céline was clerical. Christophe asked what he meant by that. André replied that he meant that she was religious and had vowed a sort of feudal service to God and his bonzes. "But how does that affect you?" I don't want to share my wife with anyone. What? You're jealous even of your wife's ideas? Why, you're more selfish even than the commandant. It's all very well for you to talk. Would you take a woman who did not love music? I have done so. How can a man and a woman live together if they don't think the same? Don't you worry about what you think. Ah, my dear fellow, ideas count for so little when one loves. What does it matter to me whether the woman I love cares for music as much as I do? She herself is music to me. When a man has the luck, as you have, to find a dear girl whom he loves and she loves him, she must believe what she likes, and he must believe what he likes. When all is said and done, what do your ideas amount to? There is only one truth in the world. There's only one God, love. You speak like a poet. You don't see life as it is. I know only too many marriages which have suffered from such a want of union in thought. Those husbands and wives did not love each other enough. You have to know what you want. Wanting does not do everything in life. Even if I wanted to marry Mademoiselle Chabarin, I couldn't. I'd like to know why. André spoke of his scruples. His position was not assured. He had no fortune and no great health. He was wondering whether he had the right to marry in such circumstances. It was a great responsibility. Was there not a great risk of bringing unhappiness on the woman he loved, and himself, not to mention any children there might be? It was better to wait or give up the idea. Christophe shrugged his shoulders. That's a fine sort of love. If she loves you, she will be happy in her devotion to you. And as for the children, you French people are absurd. You would like only to bring them into the world when you're sure of turning them out with comfortable private means, so that they will have nothing to suffer and nothing to fear. Good Lord, that's nothing to do with you. Your business is only to give them life, love of life, and courage to defend it. The rest, whether they live or die, is the common lot. Is it better to give up living than to take the risks of life? The sturdy confidence which emanated from Christophe affected André, but did not change his mind. He said, "Yes, perhaps that is true." But he stopped at that. Like all the rest, his will and power of action seemed to be paralyzed. End of section 38. Read by Sandra, 2022. Section 39 of Jean-Christophe in Paris. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Jean-Christophe in Paris by Romain Rolland. Translated by Gilbert Canon. The House, Chapter 2, Part 6. Christophe had set himself to fight the inertia which he found in most of his French friends, oddly coupled with laborious and often feverish activity. Almost all the people he met in the various middle-class houses which he visited were discontented. They had almost all the same disgust with the demagogues and their corrupt ideas. In almost all there was the same sorrowful and proud consciousness of the betrayal of the genius of their race. And it was by no means the result of any personal rancor, nor the bitterness of men and classes beaten and thrust out of power and active life, or discharged officials or unemployed energy, nor that of an old aristocracy which has returned to its estates, there to die in hiding like a wounded lion. It was a feeling of moral revolt, mute, profound, general. It was to be found everywhere in a greater or less degree, in the army, in the magistracy, in the university, in the officers, and in every vital branch of the machinery of government. But they took no active measures. They were discouraged in advance. They kept on saying, "There's nothing to be done," or "Let us try not to think of it." Fearfully they dodged anything sad in their thoughts and conversation, and they took refuge in their home life. If they had been content to refrain only from political action, but even in their daily lives these good people had no interest in doing anything definite. They put up with the degrading, haphazard contact with horrible people whom they despised, because they could not take the trouble to fight against them, thinking that any such revolt must of necessity be useless. Why, for instance, should artists, and in particular the musicians with whom Christophe was most in touch, unprotestingly put up with the effrontery of the scaramouche of the press, who laid down the law for them. There were absolute idiots among them whose ignorance in omni re scibili was proverbial, though they were none the less invested with a sovereign authority in omni re scibili. They did not even take the trouble to write their articles and books. They had secretaries, poor starving creatures, who would have sold their souls if they had had such things, for bread or women. There was no secret about it in Paris, and yet they went on, riding their high horse and patronizing the artists. Christophe used to roar with anger sometimes when he read their articles. "They have no heart," he would say. "Oh, the cowards!" "Who are you screaming at?" Olivier would ask. "The idiots of the marketplace?" "No, the honest men. These rascals are plying their trade. They lie, they steal, they rob and murder. But it is the others, those who despise them and yet let them go on, that I despise 1,000 times more. If their colleagues on the press, if honest, cultured critics and the artists on whose backs these harlequins strut and poise themselves did not put up with it in silence from shyness or fear of compromising themselves, or from some shameful anticipation of mutual service, a sort of secret pact made with the enemy so that they may be immune from their attacks, if they did not let them preen themselves in their patronage and friendship, their upstart power would soon be killed by ridicule. There's the same weakness in everything, everywhere. I've met 20 honest men who've said to me of so-and-so, 'He's a scoundrel,' but there's not one of them who would not refer to him as his dear colleague, and if he met him, shake hands with him. There are too many of them, they say. Too many cowards, too many flabby, honest men." "Eh? What do you want them to do?" "Be every man his own policeman. What are you waiting for? For heaven to take your affairs in hand? Look you, at this very moment. It is 3 days now since the snow fell. Your streets are thick with it, and your Paris is like a sewer of mud. What do? You protest against your municipal council for leaving you in such a state of filth. But do you yourselves do anything to clear it away? Not a bit of it. You sit with your arms folded. Not one of you has energy enough even to clean the pavement in front of his house. Nobody does his duty, neither the state nor the members of the state. Each man thinks he's done as much as is expected of him by laying the blame on someone else. You have to become so used, through centuries of monarchical training, to doing nothing for yourselves that you all seem to spend your time in stargazing and waiting for a miracle to happen. The only miracle that could happen would be if you all suddenly made up your minds to do something. My dear Olivier, you French people have plenty of brains and plenty of good qualities, but you lack blood. You most of all. There's nothing the matter with your mind or your heart. It's your life that's all wrong. You're sputtering out." "What can we do? We can only wait for life to return to us." "You must want life to return to you. You must want to be cured. You must use your will. And if you are to do that, you must first let in some pure air into your houses. If you won't go out of doors, then at least you must keep your houses healthy. You have let the air be poisoned by the unwholesome vapors of the marketplace. Your art and your ideas are 2/3 adulterated, and you're so dispirited that it hardly occasions you any surprise, and rouses you to no sort of indignation. Some of these good people, it's pitiful to see, are so cowed that they actually persuade themselves that they're wrong and the charlatans are right. Why, even on your Escope review, in which you profess not to be taken in by anything, I've found unhappy young men persuading themselves that they love an art and ideas for which they have not a vestige of love. They get drunk on it, without any sort of pleasure, simply because they're told to do so, and they're dying of boredom with the monstrous lie of the whole thing." Christophe passed through these wavering and dispirited creatures like a wind shaking the slumbering trees. He made no attempt to force them to his way of thinking. He breathed into them energy enough to make them think for themselves. He used to say, "You're too humble. The grand enemy is neurasthenia, doubt. A man can and must be tolerant and human, but no man may doubt what he believes to be good and true. A man must believe in what he thinks, and he should maintain what he believes. Whatever our powers may be, we have no right to forswear them. The smallest creature in the world, like the greatest, has his duty, and though he is not sufficiently conscious of it, he also has a power. Why should you think that your revolt will carry so little weight? A sturdy, upright conscience which dares assert itself is a mighty thing. More than once during the last few years you've seen the state and public opinion forced to reckon with the views of an honest man who had no other weapons but his own moral force, which with constant courage and tenacity he had dared publicly to assert. And if you must go on asking what's the good of taking so much trouble, what's the good of fighting, what's the good of it all, then I will tell you, because France is dying, because Europe is perishing, because if we did not fight our civilization, the edifice so splendidly constructed at the cost of centuries of labor by our humanity would crumble away. These are not idle words. The country is in danger. Our European mother country, and more than any, yours, your own native country, France. Your apathy is killing her. Your silence is killing her. Each of your energies as it dies, each of your ideas as it accepts and surrenders, each of your good intentions as it ends in sterility, every drop of your blood as it dries up unused in your veins means death to her. Up, up, you must live. Or if you must die, then you must die fighting, like men. But the chief difficulty lay not in getting them to do something, but in getting them to act together. They were quite unmanageable. The best of them were the most obstinate, as Christophe found in dealing with the tenants in his own house. M. Félix Valle, Elsberger, the engineer, and Commandant Chabrin lived on terms of polite and silent hostility, and yet, though Christophe knew very little of them, he could see that underneath their party and racial labels they all wanted the same thing. There were many reasons, particularly why M. Valle and the Commandant should have understood each other. By one of those contrasts common to thoughtful men, M. Valle, who never left his books and lived only in the life of the mind, had a passion for all things military. "We're all cranks," said the half-Jew Montaigne, applying to mankind in general what is perfectly true of certain types of minds, like the type of which Mr. Valle was an example. The old intellectual had the craze for Napoleon. He collected books and relics which brought to life in him the terrible dream of the imperial epic. Like many Frenchmen of that crepuscular epoch, he was dazzled by the distant rays of that glorious sun. He used to go through the campaigns, fight the battles all over again, and discuss operations. He was one of those chamber strategists who swarm in the academies and the universities, who explain Austerlitz and declare how Waterloo should have been fought. He was the first to make fun of the Napoleonite in himself. It tickled his irony, but nonetheless he went on reading the splendid stories with the wild enthusiasm of a child playing a game. He would weep over certain episodes, and when he realized that he'd been weak enough to shed tears, he would roar with laughter and call himself an old fool. As a matter of fact, he was a Napoleonite not so much from patriotism as from a romantic interest and a platonic love of action. However, he was a good patriot and much more attached to France than many an actual Frenchman. The French anti-Semites are stupid and actively mischievous in casting their insulting suspicions on the feeling for France of the Jews who have settled in the country, outside the reasons by which any family does, of necessity, after a generation or two, become attached to the land of its adoption, where the blood of the soil has become its own. The Jews have a special reason to love the nation which in the West stands for the most advanced ideas of intellectual and moral liberty. They love it because for 100 years they have helped to make it so, and its liberty is in part their work. How then should they not defend it against every menace of feudal reaction? To try, as a handful of unscrupulous politicians and a herd of wrong-headed people would like, to break the bonds which bind these Frenchmen by adoption to France, is to play into the hands of that reaction. Commandant Chabrin was one of those wrong-headed old Frenchmen who are roused to fury by the newspapers, which make out that every immigrant into France is a secret enemy, and in a human, hospitable spirit force themselves to suspect and hate and revile them, and deny the brave destiny of the race which is the conflux of all the races. Therefore he thought it incumbent on him not to know the tenant of the first floor, although he would have been glad to have his acquaintance. As for Monsieur Valle, he would have been very glad to talk to the old soldier, but he knew him for a nationalist, and regarded him with mild contempt. Christophe had much less reason than the commandant for being interested in Monsieur Valle, but he could not bear to hear ill spoken of anybody unjustly, and he broke many a lance in defense of Monsieur Valle while he was attacked in his presence. One day, when the commandant, as usual, was railing against the prevailing state of things, Christophe said to him, "It is your own fault. You all shut up yourselves inside yourselves. When things in France are not going well, to your way of thinking, you submit to it and send in your resignation. One would think it was a point of honor with you to admit yourselves beaten. I've never seen anybody lose a cause with such absolute delight. Come, commandant. You have made war? Is that fighting or anything like it?" "It is not a question of fighting," replied the commandant. "We don't fight against France. In such struggles as these we have to argue and vote and mix with all sorts of knaves and low blackguards, and I don't like it." "You seem to be profoundly disgusted. I suppose you had to do with knaves and low blackguards in Africa?" "On my honor, that did not disgust me nearly so much. Out there one could always knock them down. Besides, if it's a question of fighting, you need soldiers. I had my sharpshooters out there. Here, I'm all alone." "It isn't that there's any lack of good men." "Where are they?" "Everywhere, all around us." "Well, what are they doing?" "Just what you're doing. Nothing. They say there's nothing to be done." "Give me an instance." "Three, if you like, in this very house." Christophe mentioned Monsieur Valle. The commandant gave an exclamation. "And the Elsbeckers." He jumped in his seat. "That Jew? Those Dreyfusards?" "Dreyfusards?" said Christophe. "Well, what does that matter? It is they who've ruined France. They love France as much as you do. They're mad, mischievous lunatics. Can't you be just to your adversaries?" "I can get on quite well with loyal adversaries who use the same weapons. The proof of that is that I am here talking to you, Monsieur German. I can think well of the Germans, although some day I hope to give them back with interest the thrashing we got from them. But it is not the same thing with our enemies at home. They use underhand weapons, sophistry and unsound ideas, and a poisonous humanitarianism." "Yes, you are in the same state of mind as that of the knights of the Middle Ages, when for the first time they found themselves faced with gunpowder. What do you want? There's evolution in war, too." "So be it. But then let us be frank and say that war is war. Suppose a common enemy were to threaten Europe. Wouldn't you throw in your lot with the Germans?" "We did so, in China." "Very well, then. Look about you. Don't you see that the heroic idealism of your country and every other country in Europe is actually threatened? Don't you see that they are all more or less a prey to the adventurers of every class of society? To fight that common enemy, don't you think you should join with those of your adversaries who are of some worth and moral vigor? How can a man like you set so little store by the realities of life? Here are people who uphold an ideal which is different from your own. An ideal is a force. You cannot deny it. In the struggle in which you were recently engaged, it was your adversary's ideal which defeated you. Instead of wasting your strength in fighting against it, why not make use of it, side by side with your own, against the enemies of all ideals, the men who are exploiting your country and your wealth of ideas, the men who are bringing European civilization to rottenness? For whose sake? One must know where one is. To make our adversaries triumph? When you were in Africa, you never stopped to think whether you were fighting for the king or the republic. I fancy that not many of you ever gave a thought to the republic. They didn't care a rap. Good. and that was well for France. You conquered for her as well as for yourselves, and for the honor and the joy of it. Why not do the same here? Why not widen the scope of the fight? Don't go haggling over differences in politics and religion. These things are utterly futile. What does it matter whether your nation is the eldest daughter of the Church or the eldest daughter of reason? The only thing that does matter is that it should live. Everything that exalts life is good. There's only one enemy, pleasure-seeking egoism, which fouls the sources of life and dries them up. Exalt force, exalt the light, exalt fruitful love, the joy of sacrifice, action, and give up expecting other people to act for you. Do, act, combine, come. And he laughed and began to bang out the first bars of the march in B minor from the choral symphony. Do you know, he said, breaking off, that if I were one of your musicians, say Charpentier or Bruno, devil take the two of them, I would combine in a choral symphony, Aux armes, citoyens, l'Internationale, vive Henri IV, and Dieu protège la France. You see, something like this. I would make you a soup so hot that it would burn your mouth. It would be unpleasant, no worse in any case than what you are doing now, but I vow it would warm your victuals and that you would have to set out on the march. And he roared with laughter. The commandant laughed too. You're a fine fellow, Monsieur Kraft. What a pity you're not one of us. But I am one of you. The fight is the same everywhere. Let us close up the ranks. The commandant quite agreed, but there he stayed. Then Christophe pressed his point and brought the conversation back to Monsieur Val and the Elsbeckers, and the old soldier no less obstinately went back to his eternal arguments against Jews and Dreyfusards, and nothing that Christophe had said seemed to have had the slightest effect on him. Christophe grew despondent. Olivier said to him, Don't you worry about it. One man cannot all of a sudden change the whole state of mind of a nation. That's too much to expect. But you have done a good deal without knowing it. What have I done? Said Christophe. You are Christophe. What good is that to other people? A great deal. Just go on being what you are, my dear Christophe. Don't you worry about us. But Christophe could not surrender. He went on arguing with Commandant Chabrin, sometimes with great vehemence. It amused Céline. She was generally present at their discussions, sitting and working in silence. She took no part in the argument, but it seemed to make her more lively, and quite a different expression would come into her eyes. It was as though it gave her more breathing space. She began to read and went out a little more, and found more things to interest her. And one day, when Christophe was battling with her father about the Elsbeckers, the commandant saw her smile. He asked her what she was thinking, and she replied calmly, I think Monsieur Kraft is right. The commandant was taken aback and said, You surprise me. However, right or wrong, we are what we are, and there's no reason why we should know these people. Isn't it so, my dear? No, father, she replied. I would like to know them. The commandant said nothing, and pretended that he had not heard. He himself was much less insensible of Christophe's influence than he cared to appear. His vehemence and narrow-mindedness did not prevent his having a proper sense of justice and very generous feelings. He loved Christophe. He loved his frankness and his moral soundness, and he used often bitterly to regret that Christophe was a German. Although he always lost his temper in these discussions, he was always eager for more, and Christophe's arguments did produce an effect on him, though he would never have been willing to admit it. But one day Christophe found him absorbed in reading a book, which he would not let him see. And when Céline took Christophe to the door and found herself alone with him, she said, Do you know what he was reading? One of Mr. Wilde's books. Christophe was delighted. What does he say about it? He says, Beast, but he can't put it down. Christophe made no allusion to the fact with the commandant. It was he who asked, Why have you stopped hurling that blessed Jew at my head? Because I don't think there's any need to, said Christophe. Why? Asked the commandant aggressively. Christophe made no reply and went away laughing. Olivier was right. It is not through words that a man can influence other men, but through his life. There are people who irradiate an atmosphere of peace from their eyes and in their gestures and through the silent contact with the serenity of their souls. Christophe irradiated life. Softly, softly, like the moist air of spring, it penetrated the walls and the closed windows of the somnolent old house. It gave new life to the hearts of men and women whom sorrow, weakness, and isolation had for years been consuming, so that they were withered and like dead creatures. What a power there is in one soul over another! Those who wield that power and those who feel it are alike ignorant of its working, and yet the life of the world is in the ebb and flow controlled by that mysterious power of attraction. On the second floor, below Christophe and Olivier's room, there lived, as we have seen, a young woman of 35, a Madame Germain, a widow of 2 years' standing, who, the year before, had lost her little girl, a child of 7. She lived with her mother-in-law, and they never saw anybody. Of all the tenants of the house, they had the least to do with Christophe. They had hardly met, and they had never spoken to each other. She was a tall woman, thin but with a good figure. She had fine brown eyes, dull and rather inexpressive, though every now and then there glowed in them a hard, mournful light. Her face was sallow and her complexion waxy. Her cheeks were hollow and her lips were tightly compressed. The elder Madame Germain was a devout lady and spent all her time at church. The younger woman lived in jealous isolation in her grief. She took no interest in anything or anybody. She surrounded herself with portraits and pictures of her little girl, and by dint of staring at them she had ceased to see her as she was. The photographs and dead presentments had killed the living image of the child. She had ceased to see her as she was, but she clung to it. She was determined to think of nothing but the child, and so, in the end, she reached a point at which she could not even think of her. She had completed the work of death. There she stopped, frozen, with her heart turned to stone, with no tears to shed, with her life withered. Religion was no aid to her. She went through the formalities, but her heart was not in them, and therefore she had no living faith. She gave money for masses, but she took no active part in any of the work of the church. Her whole religion was centered in the one thought of seeing her child again. What did the rest matter? God? What had she to do with God? To see her child again, only to see her again. And she was by no means sure that she would do so. She wished to believe it, willed it hardly, desperately, but she was in doubt. She could not bear to see other children, and used to think, why are they not dead too? In the neighborhood there was a little girl who in figure and manner was like her own. When she saw her from behind with her little pigtails down her back, she used to tremble. She would follow her, and when the child turned round and she saw that it was not she would long to strangle her. She used to complain that the Elsberger children made a noise below her, though they were very quiet, and even very subdued by their upbringing. And when the unhappy children began to play about their room, she would send her maid to ask her neighbors to make them be quiet. Christophe met her once as he was coming in with the little girls, and was hurt and horrified by the hard way in which she looked at them. One summer evening, when the poor woman was sitting in the dark in the self-hypnotized condition of the utter emptiness of her living death, she heard Christophe playing. It was his habit to sit at the piano in the half-light, musing and improvising. His music irritated her, for it disturbed the empty torpor into which she had sunk. She shut the window angrily. The music penetrated through to her room. Madame Germain was filled with a sort of hatred for it. She would have been glad to stop Christophe, but she had no right to do so. Thereafter, every day at the same time, she sat waiting impatiently and irritably for the music to begin, and when it was later than usual, her irritation was only the more acute. In spite of herself, she had to follow the music through to the end, and when it was over she found it hard to sink back into her usual apathy. And one evening, when she was curled up in a corner of her dark room, and through the walls and the closed windows the distant music reached her, that light-giving music, she felt a thrill run through her, and once more tears came to her eyes. She went and opened the window and stood there, listening and weeping. The music was like rain, drop by drop falling upon her poor withered heart and giving it new life. Once more she could see the sky, the stars, the summer night. Within herself she felt the dawning of a new interest in life, as yet only a poor, pale light, vague and sorrowful sympathy for others. And that night, for the first time for many months, the image of her little girl came to her in her dreams. For the surest road to bring us near the beloved dead, the best means of seeing them again, is not to go with them into death, but to live. They live in our lives and die with us. She made no attempt to meet Christophe. Rather, she avoided him. But she used to hear him go by on the stairs with the children, and she would stand in hiding behind her door to listen to their babyish prattle, which so moved her heart. One day, as she was going out, she heard their little padding footsteps coming down the stairs, rather more noisily than usual, and the voice of one of the children saying to her sister, "Don't make so much noise, Lucette. Christophe says you mustn't because of the sorrowful lady." And the other child began to walk more quietly and to talk in a whisper. Then Madame Germain could not restrain herself. She opened the door and took the children in her arms and hugged them fiercely. They were afraid. One of the children began to cry. She let them go and went back into her own room. After that, whenever she met them, she used to try to smile at them, a poor withered smile, for she'd grown unused to smiling. She would speak to them awkwardly and affectionately, and the children would reply shyly in timid, bashful whispers. They were still afraid of the sorrowful lady, more afraid than ever, and now, whenever they passed the door, they used to run lest she should come out and catch them. She used to hide to catch sight of them as they passed. She would have been ashamed to be seen talking to the children. She was ashamed in her own eyes. It seemed to her that she was robbing her own dead child of some of the love to which only she was entitled. She would kneel down and pray for her forgiveness, but now that the instinct for life and love was newly awakened in her, she could not resist it. It was stronger than herself. One evening, as Christophe came in, he saw that there was an unusual commotion in the house. He met a tradesman who told him that the tenant of the third floor, Monsieur Vatelet, had just died suddenly of angina pectoris. Christophe was filled with pity, not so much for his unhappy neighbor as for the child who was left alone in the world. Monsieur Vatelet was not known to have any relations, and there was every reason to believe that he had left the little girl almost entirely unprovided for. Christophe raced upstairs and went into the flat on the third floor, the door of which was open. He found the Abbé Corneille with the body, and the child in tears crying to her father. The housekeeper was making clumsy efforts to console her. Christophe took the child in his arms and spoke to her tenderly. She clung to him desperately. He could not think of leaving her. He wanted to take her away, but she would not let him. He stayed with her. He sat near the window in the dying light of day and went on, rocking her in his arms and speaking to her softly. The child gradually grew calmer and went to sleep, still sobbing. Christophe laid her on her bed and tried awkwardly to undress her and undo the laces of her little shoes. It was nightfall. The door of the flat had been left open. A shadow entered with a rustling of skirts. In the fading light, Christophe recognized the fevered eyes of the sorrowful lady. He was amazed. She stood by the door and said thickly, "I came. Will you let me take her?" Christophe took her hand and pressed it. Madame Germain was in tears. Then she sat by the bedside, and a moment later she said, "Let me stay with her." Christophe went up to his own room with the Abbé Corneille. The priest was a little embarrassed and begged his pardon for coming up. He hoped, he said humbly, that the dead man would have nothing to reproach him with. He had gone not as a priest but as a friend. Christophe was too much moved to speak, and left him with an affectionate shake of the hand. Next morning, when Christophe went down, he found the child with her arms around Madame Germain's neck, with the naive confidence which makes children surrender absolutely to those who have won their affection. She was glad to go with her new friend. Alas, she had soon forgotten her adopted father. She showed just the same affection for her new mother. That was not very comforting. Did Madame Germain, in the egoism of her love, see it? Perhaps, but what did it matter? The thing is, to love. That way lies happiness. A few weeks after the funeral, Madame Germain took the child into the country, far away from Paris. Christophe and Olivier saw them off. The woman had an expression of contentment and secret joy which they had never known in her before. She paid no attention to them. However, just as they were going, she noticed Christophe and held out her hand and said, "It was you who saved me." "What's the matter with the woman?" asked Christophe in amazement as they were going upstairs after her departure. A few days later the post brought him a photograph of a little girl whom he did not know, sitting on a stool with her little hands sagely folded in her lap, while she looked up at him with clear, sad eyes. Beneath it were written these words: "With thanks from my dear dead child." End of section 39. Read by Sandra, near Montreal, 2022.
Section 40 of Jean-Christophe in Paris. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Jean-Christophe in Paris by Romain Rolland, translated by Gilbert Cannon. The House, Chapter 2, Part 7. Thus it was that the breath of life passed into all these people. In the attic on the 5th floor was a great and mighty flame of humanity, the warmth and light of which were slowly filtered through the house. But Christophe saw it not. To him the process was very slow. Ah, he would sigh, if one could only bring these good people together, all these people of all classes and every kind of belief who refuse to know each other. Can't it be done? What do you want? Said Olivier. You would need to have mutual tolerance and a power of sympathy which can only come from inward joy. The joy of a healthy, normal, harmonious existence, the joy of having a useful outlet for one's activity, of feeling that one's efforts are not wasted and that one is serving some great purpose. You would need to have a prosperous country, a nation at the height of greatness, or better still, on the road to greatness. And you must also have, the two things go together, a power which could employ all the nation's energies, an intelligent and strong power which would be above party. Now there is no power above party, save that which finds its strength in itself, not in the multitude, that power which seeks not the support of anarchical majorities, as it does nowadays, when it is no more than a well-trained dog in the hands of second-rate men, and bends all to its will by service rendered. The victorious general, the dictatorship of public safety, the supremacy of the intelligence, what you will, it does not depend on us. You must have the opportunity and the men capable of seizing it. You must have happiness and genius. Let us wait and hope. The forces are there, the forces of faith, knowledge, work, old France and new France and the greater France. What an upheaval it would be if the word were spoken, the magic word which should let loose these forces altogether. Of course, neither you nor I can say the word. Who will say it? Victory, glory, patience. The chief thing is for the strength of the nation to be gathered together, and not to rust away, and not to lose heart before the time comes. Happiness and genius only come to those peoples who have earned them by ages of stoic patience and labor and faith. Who knows, said Christophe, they often come sooner than we think, just when we expect them least. You are counting too much on the work of ages. Make ready, gird your loins, always be prepared with your shoes on your feet and your staff in your hand, for you do not know that the Lord will not pass your doors this very night. The Lord came very near that night. His shadow fell upon the threshold of the house. Following on a sequence of apparently insignificant events, relations between France and Germany suddenly became strained, and in a few days the usual neighborly attitude of banal courtesy passed into the provocative mood which precedes war. There was nothing surprising in this, except to those who were living under the illusion that the world is governed by reason. But there were many such in France, and numbers of people were amazed from day to day to see the vehement Gallophobia of the German press becoming rampant with the usual quasi-unanimity. Certain of those newspapers which in the two countries arrogate to themselves a monopoly of patriotism and speak in the nation's name and dictate to the state, sometimes with the secret complicity of the state, the policy it should follow, launched forth insulting ultimatums to France. There was a dispute between Germany and England, and Germany did not admit the right of France not to interfere. The insolent newspapers called upon her to declare for Germany, or else threatened to make her pay the chief expenses of the war. They presumed that they could wrest alliance from her fears, and already regarded her as a conquered and contented vassal, to be frank, like Austria. It only showed the insane vanity of German imperialism, drunk with victory, and the absolute incapacity of German statesmen to understand other races, so that they were always applying the simple common measure, which was law for themselves, force, the supreme reason. Naturally, such a brutal demand, made of an ancient nation rich in its past ages of a glory and a supremacy in Europe, such as Germany had never known, had had exactly the opposite effect to that which Germany expected. It had provoked their slumbering pride. France was shaken from top to base, and even the most diffident of the French roared with anger. The great mass of the German people had nothing at all to do with the provocation. They were shocked by it. The honest men of every country ask only to be allowed to live in peace, and the people of Germany are particularly peaceful, affectionate, anxious to be on good terms with everybody, and much more inclined to admire and emulate other nations than to go to war with them. But the honest men of a nation are not asked for their opinion, and they are not bold enough to give it. Those who are not virile enough to take public action are inevitably condemned to be its pawns. They are the magnificent and unthinking echo which casts back the snarling cries of the press and the defiance of their leaders, and swells them into the Marseillaise or the Wacht am Rhein. It was a terrible blow to Christophe and Olivier. They were so used to living in mutual love that they could not understand why their countries did not do the same. Neither of them could grasp the reasons for the persistent hostility which was now so suddenly brought to the surface, especially Christophe, who, being a German, had no sort of ground for ill feeling against the people whom his own people had conquered. Although he himself was shocked by the intolerable vanity of some of his fellow countrymen, and up to a certain point was entirely with the French against such a high-handed Brunswicker demand, he could not understand why France should, after all, be unwilling to enter into an alliance with Germany. The two countries seemed to him to have so many deep-seated reasons for being united, so many ideas in common, and such great tasks to accomplish together, that it annoyed him to see them persisting in their wasteful, sterile ill-feeling. Like all Germans, he regarded France as the most to blame for the misunderstanding, for though he was quite ready to admit that it was painful for her to sit still under the memory of her defeat, yet that was, after all, only a matter of vanity, which should be set aside in the higher interests of civilization and of France herself. He had never taken the trouble to think out the problem of Alsace and Lorraine. At school he had been taught to regard the annexation of those countries as an act of justice, by which, after centuries of foreign subjection, a German province had been restored to the German flag. And so he was brought down with a run, and he discovered that his friend regarded the annexation as a crime. He had never even spoken to him about these things, so convinced was he that they were of the same opinion, and now he found Olivier, of whose good faith and broad-mindedness he was certain, telling him dispassionately, without anger and with profound sadness, that it was possible for a great people to renounce the thought of vengeance for such a crime, but quite impossible for them to subscribe to it without dishonor. They had great difficulty in understanding each other. Olivier's historical argument, alleging the right of France to claim Alsace as a Latin country, made no impression on Christophe. There were just as good arguments to the contrary. History can provide politics with every sort of argument in every sort of cause. Christophe was much more accessible to the human, and not only French, aspect of the problem. Whether the Alsatians were or were not Germans was not the question. They did not wish to be Germans, and that was all that mattered. What nation has the right to say, "These people are mine, for they are my brothers"? If the brothers in question renounce that nation, though they be 1,000 times in the wrong, the consequences of the breach must always be borne by the party who has failed to win the love of the other, and therefore has lost the right to presume to bind the other's fortunes up with his own. After 40 years of strained relations, vexations, patent or disguised, and even of real advantage gained from the exact and intelligent administration of Germany, the Alsatians persist in their refusal to become Germans. And though they might give in from sheer exhaustion, nothing could ever wipe out the memory of the sufferings of the generations forced to live in exile from their native land, or what is even more pitiful, unable to leave it, and compelled to bend under a yoke which was hateful to them, and to submit to the seizure of their country and the slavery of their people. Christophe naively confessed that he had never seen the matter in that light, and he was considerably perturbed by it, and honest Germans always bring to a discussion an integrity which does not always go with the passionate self-esteem of a Latin, however sincere he may be. It never occurred to Christophe to support his argument by the citation of similar crimes perpetrated by all nations all through the history of the world. He was too proud to fall back upon any such humiliating excuse. He knew that as humanity advances, its crimes become more odious, for they stand in a clearer light. But he knew also that if France were victorious in her turn, she would be no more moderate in the hour of victory than Germany had been, and that yet another link would be added to the chain of the crimes of the nations. So the tragic conflict would drag on forever, in which the best elements of European civilization were in danger of being lost. Though the subject was terribly painful for Christophe, it was even more so for Olivier. It meant for him not only the sorrow of a great fratricidal struggle between the two nations best fitted for alliance together. In France the nation was divided, and one faction was preparing to fight the other. For years pacific and anti-militarist doctrines had been spread and propagated both by the noblest and the vilest elements of the nation. The government had for a long time held aloof with the weak-kneed dilettantism with which it handled everything which did not concern the immediate interests of the politicians, and it never occurred to it that it might be less dangerous frankly to maintain the most dangerous doctrines than to leave them free to creep into the veins of the people and ruin their capacity for war while armaments were being prepared. These doctrines appealed to the free-thinkers who were dreaming of founding a European brotherhood, working all together to make the world more just and human. They appealed also to the selfish cowardice of the rabble, who were unwilling to endanger their skins for anything or anybody. These ideas had been taken up by Olivier and many of his friends. Once or twice in his rooms Christophe had been present at discussions which had amazed him. His friend Much, who was stuffed full of humanitarian illusions, used to say with eyes blazing quite calmly that war must be abolished, and that the best way of setting about it was to incite the soldiers to mutiny, and if necessary to shoot down their leaders, and he would insist that it was bound to succeed. Elie Ellsberger would reply coldly and vehemently that if war were to break out, he and his friends would not set out for the frontier before they had settled their account with the enemy at home. André Ellsberger would take Much's part. One day Christophe came in for a terrible scene between the two brothers. They threatened to shoot each other. Although their bloodthirsty words were spoken in a bantering tone, he had a feeling that neither of them had uttered a single threat which he was not prepared to put into action. Christophe was amazed when he thought of a race of men so absurd as to be always ready to commit suicide for the sake of ideas. Madmen, crazy logicians, and yet they are good men. Each man sees only his own ideas and wishes to follow them through to the end without turning aside by a hair's breadth. and it is all quite useless, for they crush each other out of existence. The humanitarians wage war on the patriots wage war on the humanitarians, and meanwhile the enemy comes and destroys both country and humanity in one swoop. But tell me, Christophe would ask Andre Ellsberger, are you in touch with the proletarians of the rest of the nations? Someone has to begin, and we are the people to do it. We've always been the first. It is for us to give the signal. And suppose the others won't follow? They will. Have you made treaties and drawn up a plan? What's the good of treaties? Our force is superior to diplomacy. It is not a question of ideas. It's a question of strategy. If you are going to destroy war, you must borrow the methods of war. Draw up your plan of campaign in the two countries. Arrange that on such and such a date in France and Germany your allied troops shall take such and such a step. But if you go to work without a plan, how can you expect any good to come of it? With chance on the one hand and tremendous organized forces on the other, the result would never be in doubt. You would be crushed out of existence. Andre Ellsberger did not listen. He shrugged his shoulders and took refuge in vague threats. A handful of sand, he said, was enough to smash the whole machine if it were dropped into the right place in the gears. But it is one thing to discuss at leisure theoretically, and quite another to have to put one's ideas into practice, especially when one has to make up one's mind quickly. Those are frightful moments when the great tide surges through the depths of the hearts of men. They thought they were free and masters of their thoughts, but now in spite of themselves they are conscious of being dragged onwards. An obscure power of will is set against their will. Then they discover that it is not they who exist in reality, not they, but that unknown force whose laws govern the whole ocean of humanity. Men of the firmest intelligence, men the most secure in their faith, now saw it dissolve at the first puff of reality, and stood turning this way and that, not daring to make up their minds, and often, to their immense surprise, deciding upon a course of action entirely different from any that they had foreseen. Some of the most eager to abolish war suddenly felt a vigorous, passionate pride in their country leap into being in their hearts. Christophe found socialists and even revolutionary syndicalists absolutely bowled over by their passionate pride in a duty utterly foreign to their temper. At the very beginning of the upheaval, when as yet he hardly believed that the affair could be serious, he said to Andre Ellsberger, with his usual German want of tact, that now was the moment to apply his theories, unless he wanted Germany to take France. Andre fumed and replied angrily, "Just you try, swine. You haven't even guts enough to muzzle your emperor and shake off the yoke in spite of your thrice-blessed Socialist Party with its 400,000 members and its 3 million electors. We'll do it for you. Take us, we'll take you." And as they were held on and on in suspense, they grew restless and feverish. Andre was in torment. He knew that his faith was true, and yet he could not defend it. He felt that he was infected by the moral epidemic which spreads among the people of a nation, the collective insanity of their ideas, the terrible spirit of war. It attacked everybody about Christophe, and even Christophe himself. They were no longer on speaking terms, and kept themselves to themselves. But it was impossible to endure such suspense for long. The wind of action, willy-nilly, sifted the waverers into one group or another, and one day, when it seemed that they must be on the eve of the ultimatum, when in both countries the springs of action were taut, ready for slaughter, Christophe saw that everybody, including the people in his own house, had made up their minds. Every kind of party was instinctively rallied round the detested or despised government which represented France. Not only the honest men of the various parties, but the aesthetes, the masters of depraved art, took to interpolating professions of patriotic faith in their work. The Jews were talking of defending the soil of their ancestors. At the mere mention of the flag, tears came to Hamilton's eyes, and they were all sincere. They were all victims of the contagion. Andre Ellsberger and his syndicalist friends, just as much as the rest and even more, for being crushed by necessity and pledged to a party that they detested, they submitted with a grim fury and a stormy pessimism which made them crazy for action. Aubert, the artisan, torn between his cultivated humanitarianism and his instinctive chauvinism, was almost beside himself. After many sleepless nights he had at last found a formula which could accommodate everything. That France was synonymous with humanity. Thereafter he never spoke to Christophe. Almost all the people in the house had closed their doors to him. Even the good Arnauds never invited him. They went on playing music and surrounding themselves with art. They tried to forget their general obsession, but they could not help thinking of it. When either of them alone happened to meet Christophe alone, he or she would shake hands warmly, but hurriedly and furtively. And if the very same day Christophe met them together, they would pass him by with a frigid bow. On the other hand, people who had not spoken to each other for years now rushed together. One evening Olivia beckoned to Christophe to go near the window, and without a word he pointed to the Elsbergers talking to Commandant Chabran in the garden below. Christophe had no time to be surprised at such a revolution in the minds of his friends. He was too much occupied with his own mind, in which there had been an upheaval, the consequences of which he could not master. Olivier was much calmer than he, though he had much more reason to be upset. Of all Christophe's acquaintance, he seemed to be the only one to escape the contagion. Though he was oppressed by the anxious waiting for the outbreak of war and the dread of schism at home, which he saw must happen in spite of everything, he knew the greatness of the two hostile faiths which sooner or later would come to grips. He knew also that it is the part of France to be the experimental ground in human progress, and that all new ideas need to be watered with her blood before they can come to flower. For his own part, he refused to take part in the skirmish. While the civilized nations were cutting each other's throats, he was fain to repeat the device of Antigone, "I'm made for love and not for hate," for love and for understanding, which is another form of love. His fondness for Christophe was enough to make his duty plain to him. At a time when millions of human beings were on the brink of hatred, he felt that the duty and happiness of friends like himself and Christophe was to love each other and to keep their reason uncontaminated by the general upheaval. He remembered how Goethe had refused to associate himself with the liberation movement of 1813, when hatred sent Germany to march out against France. Christophe felt the same, and yet he was not easy in his mind. He who, in a way, had deserted Germany and could not return thither, he who had been fed with the European ideas of the great Germans of the 18th century, so dear to his old friend Schultz, and detested the militarist and commercial spirit of New Germany, now found himself the prey of gusty passions, and he did not know whither they would lead him. He did not tell Olivier, but he spent his days in agony, longing for news. Secretly he put his affairs in order and packed his trunk. He did not reason the thing out. It was too strong for him. Olivier watched him anxiously and guessed the struggle which was going on in his friend's mind, and he dared not question him. They felt that they were impelled to draw closer to each other than ever, and they loved each other more, but they were afraid to speak. They trembled lest they should discover some difference of thought which might come between them and divide them, as their old misunderstanding had done. Often their eyes would meet with an expression of tender anxiety, as though they were on the eve of parting forever, and they were silent and oppressed. But still, on the roof of the house that was being built on the other side of the yard, all through those days of gloom, with the rain beating down on them, the workmen were putting the finishing touches, and Christophe's friend, the loquacious Slater, laughed and shouted across, "There, the house is finished." Happily, the storm passed as quickly as it had come. The chancelleries published bulletins announcing the return of fair weather, barometrically as it were. The howling dogs of the press were dispatched to their kennels. In a few hours the tension was relieved. It was a summer evening, and Christophe had rushed in breathless to convey the good news to Olivier. He was happy and could breathe again. Olivier looked at him with a little sad smile, and he dared not ask him the question that lay next his heart. He said, "Will you have seen them all united, all these people who could not understand each other?" "Yes," said Christophe good-humouredly, "I have seen them united. You're such humbugs. You all cry out upon each other, but at bottom you're all of the same mind." "You seem to be glad of it," remarked Olivier. "Why not? Because they were united at my expense? Bah, I'm strong enough for that. Besides, it's a fine thing to feel the mighty torrent rushing you along, and the demons that were let loose in your hearts. "They terrify me," said Olivier. "I would rather have eternal solitude than have my people united at such a cost." They relapsed into silence, and neither of them dared approach the subject which was troubling them. At last Olivier pulled himself together, and in a choking voice said, "Tell me frankly, Christophe, you were going away?" Christophe replied, "Yes." Olivier was sure that he would say it, and yet his heart ached for it. He said, "Tell me, Christophe, could you? Christophe drew his hand over his forehead and said, "Don't let's talk of it. I don't like to think of it." Olivier went on sorrowfully, "You would have fought against us?" "I don't know. I never thought about it." "But in your heart you had decided?" Christophe said, "Yes." "Against me?" "Never against you. You are mine. Where I am you are too." "But against my country?" "For my country." "It is a terrible thing," said Olivier. "I love my country as you do. I love France. But could I slay my soul for her? Could I betray my conscience for her? That would be to betray her. How could I hate, having no hatred, or without being guilty of a lie, assume a hatred that I did not feel? The modern state was guilty of a monstrous crime, a crime which will prove its undoing when it presumed to impose its brazen laws on the free church of those spirits, the very essence of whose being is to love and understand. Let Caesar be Caesar, but let him not assume the Godhead. Let him take our money and our lives. Over our souls he has no rights. He shall not stain them with blood. We are in this world to give it light, not to darken it. Let each man fulfill his duty. If Caesar desires war, then let Caesar have armies for that purpose, armies as they were in olden times, armies of men whose trade is war. I'm not so foolish as to waste my time in vainly moaning and groaning in protest against force, but I'm not a soldier in the army of force. I'm a soldier in the army of the Spirit, with thousands of other men who are my brothers in arms. I represent France in that army. Let Caesar conquer the world if he will. We march to the conquest of truth." "To conquer," said Christophe, "you must vanquish, you must live. Truth is no hard dogma secreted by the brain, like a stalactite by the walls of a cave. Truth is life. It is not to be found in your own head, but to be sought for in the hearts of others. Attach yourself to them, be one of them. Think as much as you like, but do you every day take a bath of humanity. You must live in the life of others and love and bow to destiny. It is our fate to be what we are. It does not depend on us whether we shall or shall not think certain things, even though they be dangerous. We have reached such a pitch of civilization that we cannot turn back. Yes, you have reached the farthest limit of the plateau of civilization, that dizzy height to which no nation can climb without feeling an irresistible desire to fling itself down. Religion and instinct are weakened in you. You have nothing left but intelligence. You are machines grinding out philosophy. Death comes rushing in upon you. Death comes to every nation. It is a matter of centuries. Have done with your centuries. The whole of life is a matter of days and hours. If you weren't such an infernally metaphysical lot, you'd never go shuffling over into the absolute instead of seizing and holding the passing moment. What do you want? The flame burns the torch away. You can't both live and have lived, my dear Christophe. You must live. It is a great thing to have been great. It is only a great thing when there are still men who are alive enough and great enough to appreciate it. Wouldn't you much rather have been the Greeks who are dead than any of the people who are vegetating nowadays? I'd much rather be myself, Christophe, and very much alive. Olivier gave up the argument. It was not that he was without an answer, but it did not interest him. All through the discussion he had only been thinking of Christophe. He said with a sigh, "You love me less than I love you." Christophe took his hand and pressed it tenderly. "Dear Olivier," he said, "I love you more than my life, but you must forgive me if I do not love you more than life, the son of our two races. I have a horror of the night into which your false progress drags me. All your sentiments of renunciation are only the covering of the same Buddhist nirvana. Only action is living, even when it brings death. In this world we can only choose between the devouring flame and night, in spite of the sad sweetness of dreams in the hour of twilight. I have no desire for that peace which is the forerunner of death. The silence of infinite space terrifies me. Heap more faggots upon the fire. More, and yet more. Myself, too, if needs must. I will not let the fire dwindle. If it dies down, there is an end of us, an end of everything." "What you say is old," said Olivier. "It comes from the depths of the barbarous past." He took down from his shelves a book of Hindu poetry and read the sublime apostrophe of the god Krishna. "Arise and fight with a resolute heart, setting no store by pleasure or pain, or gain or loss, or victory or defeat. Fight with all thy might." Christophe snatched the book from his hands and read, "I have nothing in the world to bid me toil. There is nothing that is not mine, and yet I cease not from my labor. If I did not act without a truce and without relief, setting an example for men to follow, all men would perish. If for a moment I were to cease from my labors, I should plunge the world in chaos, and I should be the destroyer of life." "Life?" repeated Olivier. "What is life?" "A tragedy," said Christophe. "Hurrah!" End of section 40. Section 41 of Jean-Christophe in Paris. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Jean-Christophe in Paris by Romain Rolland, translated by Gilbert Cannon. The House, Chapter 2, Part 8. The panic died down. Everyone hastened to forget, with a hidden fear in their hearts. No one seemed to remember what had happened, and yet it was plain that it was still in their thoughts, from the joy with which they resumed their lives, the pleasant life from day to day, which is never truly valued until it is endangered. As usual, when danger is past, they gulped it down with renewed avidity. Christophe flung himself into creative work with tenfold vigor. He dragged Olivier after him. In reaction against their recent gloomy thoughts, they had begun to collaborate in a Rabelaisian epic. It was colored by that broad materialism which follows on periods of moral stress. To the legendary heroes, Gargantua, Friar John Panurge, Olivier had added, on Christophe's inspiration, a new character, a peasant, Jacques Patience. Simple, cunning, sly, resigned, who was the butt of the others, putting up with it when he was thrashed and robbed, putting up with it when they made love to his wife and laid waste his fields, tirelessly putting his house in order and cultivating his land, forced to follow the others to war, bearing the burden of the baggage, coming in for all the kicks and still putting up with it, waiting, laughing at the exploits of his masters and the thrashings they gave him, and saying they can't go on forever, foreseeing their ultimate downfall, looking out for it out of the corner of his eye, and silently laughing at the thought of it, with his great mouth agape. One fine day it turned out that Gargantua and Friar John were drowned while they were away on a crusade. Patience honestly regretted their loss, merely took heart of grace, saved Panurge, who was drowning also, and said, "I know that you will go on playing your tricks on me. You don't take me in, but I can't do without you. You drive away the spleen and make me laugh." Christophe set the poem to music with great symphonic pictures, with soli in chorus, mock heroic battles, riotous country fairs, vocal buffooneries, madrigals à la Jeannequin, with tremendous childlike glee, a storm at sea, the island of bells, and finally a pastoral symphony full of the air of the fields and the blithe serenity of the flutes and oboes and the clean-souled folk songs of old France. The friends worked away with boundless delight. The weakly Olivier, with his pale cheeks, found new health in Christophe's health. Gusts of wind blew through their garret, the very intoxication of joy. To be working together heart to heart with one's friend, the embrace of two lovers is not sweeter or more ardent than such a yoking together of two kindred souls. They were so near in sympathy that often the same ideas would flash upon them at the same moment. Or Christophe would write the music for a scene for which Olivier would immediately find words. Christophe impetuously dragged Olivier along in his wake. His mind swamped that of his friend and made it fruitful. The joy of creation was enhanced by that of success. Hecht had just made up his mind to publish the David, and the score well launched had had an instantaneous success abroad. A great Wagnerian Kapellmeister, a friend of Hecht's who had settled in England, was enthusiastic about it. He had given it at several of his concerts with considerable success, which, with the Kapellmeister's enthusiasm, had carried it over to Germany, where also the David had been played. The Kapellmeister had entered into correspondence with Christophe and had asked him for more of his compositions, offered to do anything he could to help him, and was engaged in ardent propaganda in his cause. In Germany, the Iphigenia, which had originally been hissed, was unearthed, and it was hailed as a work of genius. Certain facts in Christophe's life, being of a romantic nature, contributed not a little to the spurring of public interest. The Frankfurter Zeitung was the first to publish an enthusiastic article. Others followed. Then in France a few people began to be aware that they had a great musician in their midst. One of the Parisian conductors asked Christophe for his Rabelaisian epic before it was finished, and Goujart, perceiving his approaching fame, began to speak mysteriously of a friend of his who was a genius and had been discovered by himself. He wrote a laudatory article about the admirable David, entirely forgetting that only the year before he had decried it in a short notice of a few lines. Nobody else remembered it either, or seemed to be in the least astonished at his sudden change. There are so many people in Paris who are now loud in their praises of Wagner and César Franck, where formerly they roundly abused them, and actually used the fame of these men to crush those new artists whom tomorrow they will be lauding to the skies. Christophe did not set any great store on his success. He knew that he would one day win through, but he had not thought that the day could be so near at hand, and he was distrustful of so rapid a triumph. He shrugged his shoulders and said that he wanted to be left alone. He could have understood people applauding the David the year before when he wrote it, but now he was so far beyond it. He had climbed higher. He was inclined to say to the people who came and talked about his old work, "Don't worry me with that stuff. It disgusts me. So do you." And he plunged into his new work again, rather annoyed at having been disturbed. However, he did feel a certain secret satisfaction. The first rays of the light of fame are very sweet. It is good. It is healthy to conquer. It is like the open window and the first sweet scents of the spring coming into a house. Christophe's contempt for his old work was of no avail, especially with regard to the Iphigenia. There was a certain amount of atonement for him in seeing that unhappy production, which had originally brought him only humiliation, belauded by the German critics and in great request with the theatres, as he learned from a letter from Dresden, in which the directors stated that they would be glad to produce the piece during their next season. The very day when Christophe received the news which, after years of struggling, at last opened up a calmer horizon, with victory in the distance, he had another letter from Germany. It was in the afternoon. He was washing his face and talking gaily to Olivier in the next room, when the housekeeper slipped an envelope under the door. His mother's writing. He had been just on the point of writing to her, and was happy at the thought of being able to tell her of his success, which would give her so much pleasure. He opened the letter. There were only a few lines. How shaky the writing was. "My dear boy, I'm not very well. If it were possible, I should like to see you again. Love, Mother." Christophe gave a groan. Olivier, who was working in the next room, ran to him in alarm. Christophe could not speak, and pointed to the letter on the table. He went on groaning, and did not listen to what Olivier said, who took in the letter at a glance and tried to comfort him. He rushed to his bed, where he had laid his coat, dressed hurriedly, and without waiting to fasten his collar, his hands were trembling too much, went out. Olivier caught him up on the stairs. What was he going to do? Go by the first train? There wasn't one until the evening. It was much better to wait there than at the station. Had he enough money? They rummaged through their pockets, and when they counted all that they possessed between them, it only amounted to 30 francs. It was September. Hecht, the Arnauds, all their friends were out of Paris. They had no one to turn to. Christophe was beside himself, and talked of going part of the way on foot. Olivier begged him to wait for an hour, and promised to procure the money somehow. Christophe submitted. He was incapable of a single idea himself. Olivier ran to the pawn shop. It was the first time he had been there. For his own sake he would much rather have been left with nothing than pledge any of his possessions, which were all associated with some precious memory. But it was for Christophe, and there was no time to lose. He pawned his watch, for which he was advanced a sum much smaller than he had expected. He had to go home again and fetch some of his books and take them to a bookseller. It was a great grief to him, but at the time he hardly thought of it. His mind could grasp nothing but Christophe's trouble. He returned and found Christophe just where he had left him, sitting by his desk in a state of collapse. With their 30 francs, the sum that Olivier had collected was more than enough. Christophe was too upset to think of asking his friend how he had come by it, or whether he had kept enough to live on during his absence. Olivier did not think of it either. He had given Christophe all he possessed. He had to look after Christophe just like a child until it was time for him to go. He took him to the station and never left him until the train began to move. In the darkness into which he was rushing, Christophe sat wide-eyed, staring straight in front of him and thinking, "Shall I be in time?" He knew that his mother must have been unable to wait for her to write to him, and in his fevered anxiety he was impatient of the jolting speed of the express. He reproached himself bitterly for having left Louisa, and at the same time he felt how vain were his reproaches. He had no power to change the course of events. However, the monotonous rocking of the wheels and springs of the carriage soothed him gradually and took possession of his mind, like tossing waves of music dammed back by a mighty rhythm. He lived through all his past life again, from the far distant days of his childhood, loves, hopes, disillusion, sorrows, and that exultant force, that intoxication of suffering, enjoying and creating, that delight in blotting out the light of life and its sublime shadows, which was the soul of his soul, the living breath of the God within him. Now, as he looked back on it, all was clear. His tumultuous desires, his uneasy thoughts, his faults, mistakes, and headlong struggles now seemed to him to be the eddy and swirl borne on by the great current of life towards its eternal goal. He discovered the profound meaning of those years of trial. Each test was a barrier which was burst by the gathering waters of the river, a passage from a narrow to a wider valley which the river would soon fill. Always he came to a wider view and a freer air. Between the rising ground of France and the German plain, the river had carved its way, not without many a struggle, flooding the meadows, eating away the base of the hills, gathering and absorbing all the waters of the two countries. So it flowed between them, not to divide, but to unite them. In it they were wedded, and for the first time Christophe became conscious of his destiny, which was to carry through the hostile peoples, like an artery, all the forces of life and of the two sides of the river. A strange serenity, a sudden calm and clarity came over him, as sometimes happens in the darkest hours. Then the vision faded, and he saw nothing but the tender, sorrowful face of his old mother. It was hardly dawn when he reached the little German town. He had to take care not to be recognized, for there was still a warrant of arrest out against him. But nobody at the station took any notice of him. The town was asleep. The houses were shut up and the streets deserted. It was the grey hour when the lights of the night are put out and the light of day is not yet come, the hour when sleep is sweetest and dreams are lit with the pale light of the east. A little servant girl was taking down the shutters of a shop and singing an old German folk song. Christophe almost choked with emotion. "O fatherland, beloved!" He was fain to kiss the earth as he heard the humble song that set his heart aching in his breast. He felt how unhappy he had been away from his country and how much he loved it. He walked on, holding his breath. When he saw his old house, he was obliged to stop and put his hand to his lips to keep himself from crying out. How would he find his mother whom he had deserted? He took a long breath and almost ran to the door. It was ajar. He pushed it open. No one there. The old wooden staircase creaked under his footsteps. He went up to the top floor. The house seemed to be empty. The door of his mother's room was shut. Christophe's heart thumped as he laid his hand on the door knob, and he had not the strength to open it. Louisa was alone in bed, feeling that the end was near. Of her 2 other sons, Rodolphe, the businessman, had settled in Hamburg. The other, Ernest, had emigrated to America, and no one knew what had become of him. There was no one to attend to her, except a woman in the house, who came twice a day to see if Louisa wanted anything, stayed for a few minutes, and then went about her business. She was not very punctual, and was often late in coming. To Louisa it seemed quite natural that she should be forgotten, as it seemed to her quite natural to be ill. She was used to suffering, and was as patient as an angel. She had heart disease and palpitations, during which she would think she was going to die. She would lie with her eyes wide open, and her hands clutching the bedclothes, and the sweat dripping down her face. She never complained. She knew that it must be so. She was ready. She had already received the sacrament. She had only one anxiety, lest God should find her unworthy to enter into paradise. She endured everything else in patience. In a dark corner of her little room, near her pillow on the wall of the recess, she had made a little shrine for her relics and trophies. She had collected the portraits of those who were dear to her, her 3 children, her husband, for whose memory she had always preserved her love, in his first freshness, the old grandfather, and her brother, Gottfried. She was touchingly devoted to all those who had been kind to her, though it were never so little. On her coverlet, close to her eyes, she had pinned the last photograph of himself that Christophe had sent her, and his last letters were under her pillow. She had a love of neatness and scrupulous tidiness, and it hurt her to know that everything was not perfectly in order in her room. She listened for the little noises outside which marked the different moments of the day for her. It was so long since she had first heard them. All her life had been spent in that narrow space. She thought of her dear Christophe, how she longed for him to be there, near her just then, and yet she was resigned even to his absence. She was sure that she would see him again on high. She had only to close her eyes to see him. She spent days and days, half unconscious, living in the past. She would see once more the old house on the banks of the Rhine, a holiday, a superb summer day. The window was open. The white road lay gleaming under the sun. They could hear the birds singing. Melchior and the old grandfather were sitting by the front door, smoking and chatting and laughing uproariously. Louisa could not see them, but she was glad that her husband was at home that day, and that grandfather was in such a good temper. She was in the basement cooking the dinner, an excellent dinner. She watched over it as the apple of her eye. There was a surprise, a chestnut cake. Already she could hear the boy's shout of delight. The boy, where was he? Upstairs? She could hear him practicing at the piano. She could not make out what he was playing, but she was glad to hear the familiar tinkling sounds, and to know that he was sitting there with his grave face. What a lovely day! The merry jingling bells of a carriage went by on the road. Oh, good heavens, the joint! Perhaps it had been burned while she was looking out of the window. She trembled lest grandfather, of whom she was so fond, though she was afraid of him, should be dissatisfied and scold her. Thank heaven, there was no harm done. There, everything was ready, and the table was laid. She called Melchior and grandfather. They replied eagerly. And the boy? He had stopped playing. His music had ceased a moment ago, without her noticing it. Christophe! What was he doing? There was not a sound to be heard. He was always forgetting to come down to dinner. Father was going to scold him. She ran upstairs. Christophe! He made no sound. She opened the door of the room where he was practicing. No one there. The room was empty, and the piano was closed. Louisa was seized with a sudden panic. What had become of him? The window was open. Oh, heaven! Perhaps he had fallen out. Louisa's heart stops. She leans out and looks down. Christophe! He is nowhere to be found. She rushes all over the house. Downstairs, grandfather shouts to her, "Come along, don't worry, he'll come back." She will not go down. She knows that he is there, that he is hiding for fun to tease her. Oh, naughty, naughty boy. Yes, she is sure of it now. She heard the floor creak. He is behind the door. She tries to open the door, but the key is gone. The key. She rummages through a drawer, looking for it in a heap of keys. This one, that, no, not that. Ah, that's it. She cannot fit it into the lock. Her hand is trembling so. She is in such haste. She must be quick. Why? She does not know, but she knows that she must be quick, and that if she doesn't hurry, she will be too late. She hears Christophe breathing on the other side of the door. Oh! Bother the key at last. The door is opened. A cry of joy. It is he. He flings his arms round her neck. Oh, naughty, naughty, good, darling boy. She has opened her eyes. He is there, standing by her. For some time he had been standing looking at her, so changed she was, with her face both drawn and swollen, and her mute suffering made her smile of recognition so infinitely touching, and the silence and her utter loneliness, it rent his heart. She saw him. She was not surprised. She smiled all that she could not say, a smile of boundless tenderness. She could not hold out her arms to him, nor utter a single word. He flung his arms round her neck and kissed her, and she kissed him. Great tears were trickling down her cheeks. She said in a whisper, "Wait." He saw that she could not breathe. Neither stirred. She stroked his head with her hands, and her tears went on trickling down her cheeks. He kissed her hands and sobbed with his face hidden in the coverlet. When her attack had passed, she tried to speak, but she could not find words. She floundered, and he could hardly understand her. But what did it matter? They loved each other, and were together, and could touch each other. That was the main thing. He asked indignantly why she was left alone. She made excuses for her nurse. "She cannot always be here. She has her work to do." In a faint, broken voice, she could hardly pronounce her words. She made a little hurried request about her burial. She told Christophe to give her love to her 2 other sons who had forgotten her, and she sent a message to Olivier, knowing his love for Christophe. She begged Christophe to tell him that she sent him her blessing, and then timidly she recollected herself and made use of a more humble expression, her affectionate respects. Once more she choked. He helped her to sit up in her bed. The sweat dripped down her face. She forced herself to smile. She told herself that she had nothing more to wish for in the world, now that she had her son's hand clasped in hers. And suddenly Christophe felt her hand stiffen in his. Louisa opened her lips. She looked at her son with infinite tenderness. So the end came. End of section 41.
Section 42 of Jean-Christophe in Paris. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Jean-Christophe in Paris by Romain Rolland. Translated by Gilbert Canin. The House. Chapter 3. In the evening of the same day, Olivier arrived. He had been unable to bear the thought of leaving Christophe alone in those tragic hours of which he had had only too much experience. He was fearful also of the risks his friend was running in returning to Germany. He wanted to be with him, to look after him, but he had no money for the journey. When he returned from seeing Christophe off, he made up his mind to sell the few family jewels that he had left, and as the pawnshop was closed at that hour, and he wanted to go by the next train, he was just going out to look for a broker's shop in the neighbourhood, when he met Mouche on the stairs. When the little Jew heard what he was about, he was genuinely sorry that Olivier had not come to him. He would not let Olivier go to the broker's, and made him accept the necessary money from himself. He was really hurt to think that Olivier had pawned his watch, and sold his books to pay Christophe's fare, when he would have been only too glad to help them. In his zeal for doing them a service, he even proposed to accompany Olivier to Christophe's home, and Olivier had great difficulty in dissuading him. Olivier's arrival was a great boon to Christophe. He had spent the day prostrated with grief, alone by his mother's body. The nurse had come, performed certain offices, and then had gone away and had never come back. The hours had passed in the stillness of death. Christophe sat there as still as the body. He never took his eyes from his mother's face. He did not weep, he did not think. He was himself as one dead. Olivier's wonderful act of friendship brought him back to tears and life. Getrost, es ist der Schmerzen wert, dies haben so lang mit uns ein treues Auge weint. Courage. Life is worth all its suffering as long as there are faithful friends to weep with us. They clasped each other in a long embrace, and then sat by the dead woman's side and talked in whispers. Night had fallen. Christophe, with his arms on the foot of the bed, told random tales of his childhood's memories, in which his mother's image ever recurred. He would pause every now and then for a few minutes, and then go on again, until there came a pause when he stopped altogether, and his face drooped into his hands. He was utterly worn out, and when Olivier went up to him he saw that he was asleep. Then he kept watch alone, and presently he too was overcome by sleep, with his head leaning against the back of the bed. There was a soft smile on Louise's face, and she seemed happy to be watching over her 2 children. In the early hours of the morning they were awakened by a knocking at the door. Christophe opened it. It was a neighbour, a joiner, who had come to warn Christophe that his presence in the town had been denounced, and that he must go if he did not wish to be arrested. Christophe refused to fly. He would not leave his mother before he had taken her to her last resting place. But Olivier begged him to go and promised that he would faithfully watch over her in his stead. He induced him to leave the house, and to make sure of his not going back on his decision, went with him to the station. Christophe refused point blank to go without having a sight of the great river by which he had spent his childhood, the mighty echo of which was preserved forever within his soul as in a seashell. Though it was dangerous for him to be seen in the town, yet for his whim he disregarded it. They walked along the steep bank of the Rhine, which was rushing along in its mighty peace, between its low banks, on to its mysterious death in the sands of the north. A great iron bridge, looming in the mist, plunged its 2 arches like the halves of the wheels of a colossal chariot into the grey waters. In the distance, fading into the mist, were ships sailing through the meadows along the river's windings. It was like a dream, and Christophe was lost in it. Olivier brought him back to his senses, and taking his arm led him back to the station. Christophe submitted. He was like a man walking in his sleep. Olivier put him into the train as it was just starting, and they arranged to meet next day at the first French station, so that Christophe should not have to go back to Paris alone. The train went, and Olivier returned to the house, where he found 2 policemen stationed at the door waiting for Christophe to come back. They took Olivier for him, and Olivier did not hurry to explain a mistake so favourable to Christophe's chances of escape. On the other hand, the police were not in the least discomfited by their blunder, and showed no great zest in pursuing the fugitive, and Olivier had an inkling that at bottom they were not at all sorry that Christophe had gone. Olivier stayed until the next morning, when Louisa was buried. Christophe's brother Rodolphe, the businessman, came by one train and left by the next. That important personage followed the funeral very correctly, and went immediately it was over, without addressing a single word to Olivier, either to ask him for news of his brother or to thank him for what he had done for their mother. Olivier spent a few hours more in the town, where he did not know a soul, though it was peopled for him with so many familiar shadows, the boy Christophe, those whom he loved, and those who had made him suffer, and dear Antoinette. What was there left of all these human beings who had lived in the town, the family of the Crafts, that now had ceased to be? Only the love for them that lived in the heart of a stranger. In the afternoon Olivier met Christophe at the frontier station as they had arranged. It was a village nestling among wooded hills. Instead of waiting for the next train to Paris, they decided to go part of the way on foot, as far as the nearest town. They wanted to be alone. They set out through the silent woods, through which from a distance there resounded the dull thud of an axe. They reached a clearing at the top of a hill. Below them, in a narrow valley, in German territory, there lay the red roof of a forester's house, and a little meadow like a green lake amid the trees. All around there stretched the dark blue sea of the forest, wrapped in cloud. Mists hovered and drifted among the branches of the pines. A transparent veil softened the lines and blurred the colours of the trees. All was still. Neither footsteps nor voices were to be heard. A few drops of rain rang out on the golden copper leaves of the beeches which had turned to autumn tints. A little stream ran tinkling over the stones. Christophe and Olivier stood still and did not stir. Each was dreaming of those whom he had lost. Olivier was thinking, "Antoinette, where are you?" And Christophe, "What is success to me now that she is dead?" But each heard the comforting words of the dead. "Beloved, weep not for us. Think not of us. Think of him." They looked at each other, and each ceased to feel his own sorrow, and was conscious only of that of his friend. They clasped their hands. In both there was sad serenity. Gently, while no wind stirred, the misty veil was raised. The blue sky shone forth again. The melting sweetness of the earth after rain, so near to us, so tender. The earth takes us in her arms, clasps us to her bosom with a lovely, loving smile, and says to us, "Rest, all is well." The ache in Christophe's heart was gone. He was like a little child. For 2 days he'd been living wholly in the memory of his mother, the atmosphere of her soul. He had lived over again her humble life, with its days one like unto another, solitary, all spent in the silence of the childless house, in the thought of the children who had left her, the poor old woman, infirm but valiant in her tranquil faith, her sweetness of temper, her smiling resignation, her complete lack of selfishness. And Christophe thought also of all the humble creatures he had known. How near to them he felt in that moment, after all the years of exhausting struggle in the burning heat of Paris, where ideas and men jostle in the whirl of confusion, after those tragic days when there had passed over them the wind of the madness which hurls the nations, cozened by their own hallucinations, murderously against each other. Christophe felt utterly weary of the fevered, sterile world, the conflict between egoisms and ideas, the little groups of human beings deeming themselves above humanity, the ambitious, the thinkers, the artists who think themselves the brain of the world and are no more than a haunting, evil dream. And all his love went out to those thousands of simple souls of every nation, whose lives burn away in silence, pure flames of kindness, faith, and sacrifice, the heart of the world. Yes, he thought, I know you. Once more I've come to you. You are blood of my blood. You are mine, like the prodigal son I left you to pursue the shadows that passed by the wayside. But I've come back to you. Give me welcome. We are one. Life is ours, both the living and the dead. Where I am, there are you also. Now I bear you in my soul, O mother who bore me. You too, Gottfried, and you, Schultz, and Sabine, and Antoinette. You're all in me, part of me, mine. You are my riches, my joy. We will take the road together. I will never more leave you. I will be your voice. We will join forces, so we shall attain the goal. A ray of sunlight shot through the dripping branches of the trees. From the little field down below there came up the voices of children singing an old German folk song, frank and moving. The singers were 3 little girls dancing round the house, and from afar the west wind brought the chiming of the bells of France, like a perfume of roses. Oh, peace, divine harmony, serene music of the soul set free, wherein are mingled joy and sorrow, death and life, the nations at war and the nations in brotherhood. I love you, I long for you, I shall win you. The night drew down her veil. Starting from his dream, Christophe saw the faithful face of his friend by his side. He smiled at him and embraced him. Then they walked on through the forest in silence, and Christophe showed Olivier the way. Taciti, soli e senza compagnia, non davan e un dinanzi, e altro dopo, come I frati minor vanno per via. End of section 42, read by Sandra. End of Jean-Christophe in Paris by Romain Rolland, translated by Gilbert Canon.